Anyway, I think there was a lot of interesting figures that came up. I think one of them, of course, is struggle, the idea of the demand that also came up yesterday. Then I think there are, of course, certain notions of the law. And so, again, I would say a double production or projection of the people. Once in this idea of mobilization and organization, but also the one of being addressed as the people, for example, of a nation. So in a kind of enforced invocation, which I think also came up in some of the political examples. And then I think, yeah, also the notion of laughter that came up yesterday came up now. So, but I think that I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the room, so I'll actually go straight to questions rather than sit here and ask you some. So we have the microphones. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm Andrea Phillips. Lots of questions, but I wanted to ask Nina first. I mean, I won't ask loads of questions, don't worry. Nina, why, I'm going to say it kind of a bit dumbly in a sense, but my question is, why shouldn't art and its institutions talk about itself? You kind of dismissed. The reason I ask it is not defensively, effectively, but because it seems to me that one of the things that came up yesterday, and I you know, it would be interesting for you to expand a little bit on your criticisms of some of the things that came up yesterday, in terms of the question about why art shouldn't address itself, in a sense. But one of the things that came up yesterday, of course, was a set of questions, critiques of the art world and its institutional politics, but nevertheless, a kind of a set of demands that were unanswered and nebulous in many ways, so you're right in that respect, whereby art does address itself as a political subject, as a site of solidarity and struggle. So I wondered why you thought that art shouldn't address itself.
I mean, look, it's not that it shouldn't. I mean, how could I possibly prescribe that? The point would be, it's just that's you know, in a way, the dominant, you know, that's all we do, right? So the point is not to say stop doing it, right? It's just that's all there is, right? It's like saying, you know, what's after this or what's beyond this? You know, given that art has basically assumed the role of the place where, you know, a public or a fantasy of the public, usually a very self-selecting image of a certain kind of public, can talk about anything, right? Right, and it's elected itself in that way, and of course it's kind of narcissistic and it's solipsistic, and like every, you know, kind of discussion is, right? It always talks about itself. The problem is where there's nothing else outside of that, right? That's the issue. So if there's nowhere else to talk about anything, you know, it just becomes this, I don't know, it's just, I don't know, too dominant. And look, I know I'm in a bad mood and I'm being an asshole, and I know that, right? But you know, this is the only place I can be like this.
No, but I wasn't asking the question. Well, there you go.
I know, right? Thanks, Art.
But just okay. So I will ask another one before I hand the microphone over to somebody else. But no, I'm actually taking what you said actually as an important challenge, but to try and link it to some of the things that came up yesterday, whereby we do have to think of art in a more formal sense rather than as a kind of simply. I mean, again, Maria at the very beginning of yesterday made this distinction between critique and proposition, which I think we need to take seriously. We talked in the pub last night about modes of solidarity. Of course, all the best conversations happen in the pub, but I wondered whether you could just push the criticism of this nebulousness. I mean, what do we do with it?
Okay, well, look, one thing would be to literally materially identify the topology and the locations of art. So look at these places. You know, what could we do with them? What would it, you know, what would happen? I have this recurring fantasy of like stealing police horses and like pushing them into Tate Modern, right?
But that's
like
already been done by an artist.
No, I know, but I don't mean as art. Right? And look, I mean, but the issue is, this always comes up with, you know, the issue you push up against is then this kind of preservation of the archive and preservation of art and people's actual resistance, like real profound refusal to talk about what it would mean to destroy this, right? And that's the issue. But, you know, look, there's loads of spaces, do you know what I mean? Massive amounts of spaces, right? There aren't any other spaces. So I'm kind of interested in these buildings. Like, what can we do with these buildings?
Absolutely. I completely agree. Somebody take the microphone for me.
Say more.
Anyone else?
Can I respond to that? Is that all right? I think.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
The thing that strikes me with the issue of there being too much talking in art and philosophy and other things as well is that if you think about business and its objection to talking, business objects to talking because the market will decide whether something's successful or not, regardless of what you say and what you believe and what your values are. So the thing will sell or it won't sell. The thing will make you money or it won't make you money. And the values that you attach to it are private and are kind of worthless to other people. And economists have this phrase which they use in a sneering way. And the phrase is inherent value. And they think that inherent value simply does not exist. The only value that anything has is its economic value, and the economic value is determined by the market. And what you call inherent value is of no concern to anybody else. So what happens in art, I think, is that we talk a lot about things because we believe in different kind of values other than economic value, in which case, if something doesn't sell, it doesn't make it bad, and if something does sell, it doesn't make it good. So we talk about value independently of what the market decides is valuable. And we end up doing a hell of a lot of talking because we have to counteract a hell of a lot of value production within the market. So the more value production there is in the market, the more we have to talk to counteract it. That's why I think we talk so much.
But Dave, I don't think we talk more than economists. I mean, first of all, I think first of all,
no, it's a different kind of talking.
Capital is a linguistic category.
No, I'm not talking about the actual amount of words that are used.
And
I'm talking about the apparent worthlessness of the kind of talk that we do. That's what I'm talking about, not the number of words. It's why do you keep talking about this sort of stuff? Okay. And that sort of stuff that we talk about is the kind of stuff that has no economic rationale at all.
Yeah, but there are loads of different ways of talking about value, and one of them would be care, and it would be care in practice, for example. You know, you don't have to, you know, actually in a weird way, what I'm objecting to is, in a sense, a lack of a discussion of value that's happening, right? Why don't we talk about emotional value or care, right? And the relationship between that and art. Do you know what I mean? I don't disagree with you, but I'm just frustrated with apparently everything. I should just go home and go to bed.
But I mean, I think also a lot of talking happens within social movements and mobilization. So art isn't the only place where one can engage in these conversations that aren't about capitalist forms of value. And so I think in some ways it's the kind of demand is to push those two frameworks together on some level. And I think, I mean, I have the same fantasies. When I started working at the Serpentine, I imagined my friends coming in and dislocating the two directors to an island where they could write their memoirs forever and ever as a kind of fantasy of what could be done with this organization if the comrades took over. So I think, you know, I was plagued by these dreams for almost a year. You know, it's quite tangible, like, set of circumstances, and you can look at them as material spaces and also processes that could be redirected. And there have been particular moments in which, you know, certain galleries or cultural institutions have played with these ideas for like 5 minutes, but you know, and then revert back into the paradigm. And I think so. I think I agree with the worthless talk kind of thing, but I think there's a way of engaging in anti-capitalist conversation or non-capitalistic conversation that isn't only in the art world and sort of reiterating and sometimes reifying this kind of hermetic space. So I think this call for proposition, I think, is actually really useful, and maybe something that could come out of this encounter on some level is what are those propositions, because actually we're actually losing ground in terms of these kind of critical spaces right now, and that might be an opportunity as well, but actually if you occupy the cultural sector, you would never know that. Do you know what I mean? There's no real proposal on the table, actually. Not a critical one, not a conservative one, nothing. It's just, we just keep kind of talking and hoping it'll go away, you know.
Yeah, I think.
I just want to briefly say something about this apparent opposition between speech and action, which I think is inherently unstable. The whole idea of narrative action is, as Hannah Arendt proposes it, is that narrative is already in the scene of action. It is that which calls forth action into the world. And we have this morning been talking a little bit about fiction as the site of something that is fantastical or that is some way unreal. In fact, many of us are politicized specifically through our encounter with stories. So I would want to, challenge this assumed kind of opposition between the real and the fictitious, or between speech and action, which I think, as the quotations from major politicians across the world show, are actually already fused.
I'm not against words. I quite like them.
I'll say something than my neighbor, I guess. I just wanted to kind of echo this thing and say, art as a political technique has its limits. Art and its political technique has its limits, and it's only overcome. Those limits are only overcome in coincidences. To imagine that art and its ecology is the solution is limiting and frustrating. But the specific productive technologies of political life beyond, but not excluding art, is meaningful. Again, the specific productive technologies of political life beyond, but not excluding art, is meaningful. And so for myself, I guess I find the potentials in a conversations like this, when they are aware of the specific ecologies of art as a limited form.
This is a comment. I don't know.
I could speak to it.
Yeah.
Just responding briefly to that. I think we have sort of not noticed that there are all these positions that lie between art and politics. I like to use the phrase not art, not politics, to sort of suggest that there are these things which actually are, we still don't really know what they are. You know, they're not art, and they're not politics. And so we see them arising all the time. And when Nina is frustrated about, the kind of the way that art takes over, I think we need to remember that in a kind of pale imitation of the political, I think we need to remember that there are actually lots of events, of experiences, which the art world fails to take notice of at all, and which are very interesting and which are gradually eroding the categorical distinctions between these different disciplinary activities.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would want to say something like, actions like book block, for example, right, is, seems to me like a really good paradigmatic example of what the relationship between culture and politics is. I'm not saying everything has to be like that, and I'm not against it, and obviously I'm just projecting in lots of ways, but something like book block, right, why is book block effective? Well, why is it interesting, right? Because it's both symbolic and it's material, right? You can literally defend yourself against the police. You can literally break your way out of a kettle using the shields. At the same time, right, the image of the spectacle where you have a photo of, books being smashed, right? It's very, very effective. It absolutely symbolises what the very thing that's happening, right? The destruction of free education, the destruction of learning, the destruction of creativity and art, right? And like groups like Precarious Workers Brigade and all of these groups who are very, very like an Arts Against Cuts, whose politics are absolutely like intrinsically linked to their art and their material practice, right? And I'm not saying, I don't know. I don't want this to end up be like, you know, oh, I'm against art or something, or, you know, I don't want it to be reduced like that. I'm just, you know, it strikes me that there are loads of really positive examples of what happens when people think systematically and materially about what it is to produce art in this world, you know. So like when Precarious Workers Brigade publish anything, their first footnote is always to absolutely detail what money they got for this, right, how it was divided among the group, and, you know, where the money comes from and all that sort of thing. And I'm really interested in these kind of like actions and what it means to, so for example, to boycott particular institutions because the money's dirty, right? What it means to not exhibit, even from a position of poverty, where you don't have a choice, really. You know, to be freelance artist is fucking impossible, right? And you have to do shit work, intern work, free work, blah, blah, blah. You jump at any opportunity. But what does it mean to refuse from that position, not to exhibit at Tate or Zublodovic Gallery or whatever, or, you know, to be involved in these things, right? I mean, it's possible. People are doing it all the time.
Can I just say something about that? Because I'm a member of the group, so I should say something. But also that but also the importance of the internal conversation of the PWB was not always about that, but also about solidarities with other groups. And I think that was a crucial move for us to play, which was also about getting out of the hermetic conversation about the art world, which can then not just then be turned on the conditions of the art world itself, which are important to address. And of course, the first step in sort of any kind of emancipatory process is to analyze one's own conditions, but to use that as the basis from which to engage in solidarity work. And so that, you know, the work I was talking about of raids against migrants and that kind of thing was done through the PWB and through a kind of solidarity relationship with the Latin American workers group in London. But I think, and out of that, we came to also a set of really interesting relationships around the conversation around what role art plays outside of cultural institutions and the conversation PWB was in. So, you know, members of Latin American workers understood that they were engaged already in aesthetic practices, had all kinds of myriad conversations about what role art played, and had never engaged in a conversation with a cultural institution and had no interest in doing so. And I think that, you know, that's sort of what you're talking about is the spectrum of practices that have to be taken into account, and to distinguish between art as a set of practices and tools and cultural institutions, which are quite different kinds of formations, I think, on some level.
Hello, yeah, hi. My name's Anne-Marie Twigg. I was wondering, thinking about Simone's talk yesterday, and I wanted to throw in this other body of like the creative industries and about aesthetics, and again those relationships towards the audience or working with the audience or the public, and how that in the arts, I mean, I'm talking from the Netherlands because I'm based in the Netherlands right now, and what you do see there is that a lot of funding is moving into more of the creative industries and social design, and that relations and values are built up and constructed in different ways than the arts have done or are doing at the moment. So yeah, I was wondering, could you give some insight as in like how's that in the UK? There is a dynamic, there is something going on there which I think is relevant to, again, like addressing the public and how we address the public as an arts.
Well, I mean, I'm fairly new to the UK, so probably others can answer this better than me. But of course, it's I think the kind of public defunding of the arts and obsession with creative industry, I mean, started here much earlier than in most of the European countries. So in that sense, it's really a kind of avant-garde in implementing. But I think maybe just to add to that, I guess there's one thing that sort of struck me also, Dave, when you said, well, we do a different kind of talking. And then I guess that has to be defined as a we. And for me, that we is not the art world. Because the art world as such is not united. And I think more and more the art world does not have that conversation, but is actually conversing only through what you call this kind of market values, particularly in this town. So, yeah. So I think that needs to be considered as well. It's not even that the cultural sector is a minority; it's a minority within that sector.
I think we've also got to get away from this apparent opposition between the market on the one hand and then the public on the other. You know, that public art isn't a market, or that the market isn't addressing a public, because that just doesn't work. And also that public art isn't the only way of thinking about not working within the market. So that we've got to be careful not to just like throw ourselves into this kind of engagement with the public because of our, political interests or our aesthetic interests or something like that. So because what in a sense what you want to get away from two things simultaneously. One is you don't want to unify art and then say I'm for art, all of it. Like who the hell's for all of it? You know what I mean? Or then if you're against all of it, what if you're against all of it and then throw yourself into the public and it's like, what do you mean, all of it? So the public is not the cure for art, and art isn't the cure for the market. So I think we just need to be much more kind of nuanced about these things, and maybe throw in a few more terms as well, not just stick with these kind of tried and tested ones. So.
I would like to come back for a moment to this theme of the narrative. I'm very much interested in narrative as a kind of a means of expanding our imagination, as a kind of a tool of exploring some proposals for future as well. There is this book of Max Haven about the crisis of imagination, in which he states that our imagination now is somehow impaired, that we are somehow unable to think, to go beyond the details of empirical reality and imagine some kind of a completely new possibilities. But there is also this problem that it seems that the narratives that we are now producing in our culture are very different from this kind of a more consistent traditional narratives. Douglas Rushkoff is writing about it. He writes that we live in a culture of presentism, that the narratives that we produce are very somehow illogical, and he analyzes, for example, The Simpsons, and also the emergence of very ambitious TV series is not such a good sign, as they are very, very much not imaginative enough, and they are not so consistent. They don't have any kind of defined end, for example. So I wonder, and there is also this problem of following a narrative, like devoting a lot of time to it. I don't know what is your experience, but when I was a child, I really could lay in bed for the whole day and read a book, and now it's not happening anymore. It's the ability to concentrate on a kind of a longer narrative is very much somehow not present anymore. So I wonder if this potential of the narrative can be really somehow used now.
I guess that's yeah.
I think the potential of the narrative is being used all the time. I mean, that's the point. And it's not just being used by people that see themselves as narrators. It's being used by Gorbachev. It's being used by, by Barack Obama. It's being used all the time. It's being used by the ref. It's being used by Goldsmiths in the submission of the ref. Narrative, I think it's not a question of kind of seeing narrative as potentially a sort of, although it can be potentially an emancipatory kind of mode of action, but it's also potentially the opposite. What's interesting for me is the fact that it operates both in art and in politics, or that it operates aesthetically as well as politically. And it's this shared mode of operation which I think is often not remarked on. Story is incredibly important to us, and I think it's time that we sort of paid attention to the politicality of story. and to the way that we can shape our own stories, as well as to our limitations at being able to shape our own stories. That's my point, I guess. Anyone else want to join in?
Yeah.
Andrea?
Is there anybody else there?
Nobody else? Okay, thanks. Dave, I'll throw another word in then. So it's not particularly nuanced, but I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more, or other people as well, about the state, which you invoked as one of the constructions of art. I mean, in your narrative, if I followed it right. I have here, and maybe it's not direct, it may be faulty, art becomes art when the state makes it address the people. That's probably a bastardization of something you said somewhere in the middle of your talk. But I'm trying to link the concept of organisation and organisation, between artists and other people struggling in different situations and environments that has been invoked here. For instance, in terms of Art Uncut, or the Precarious Workers Brigade and the Moses Operation. And at the same time, the concept of public art that might be understood outside of art, which is simply public art is that which is funded by the state. Yeah, so that's one other version of thinking about public art. And how actually one of the problems we have effectively, and what I will call a political problem, is the fact that on the one hand we are, and I don't know what we I'm using there, have an interest in joining, and often do join in with struggles that are parallel between art and other forms of struggle, but at the same time I might also want to defend art being funded by the state. And it would seem to me that that is a fundamental political contradiction. And so what do we do with it? Because because we need to think through that. Otherwise, until we think through that, then we can't make a proper proposition. A proper proposition. So what does that mean?
Just to give a bit of context to that original point about art becoming art. The Renaissance had no concept of art. The Greeks had no concept of art. The concept of art as a singular term, meaning multiple things, originates in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And before that you had the arts, and the art of painting, but also the art of cooking and all kinds of other skills. And art was invented as a new singular abstract term alongside and in association with the French Revolution. And the first action to take place in a sense in favour of art and to anoint this new thing called art was the nationalisation of the Louvre. And the Louvre was a national, state-owned, public institution for this new thing called art. So the establishment of the Louvre as, in the sense of marginalising some things that had been part of princely collections and raising others, primarily painting and sculpture, then give us this thing, and that kind of then spreads across the whole of Europe, so that within 50 years, every European capital has a version of the Louvre. So Europe has now got this thing called art, and by and large, this is achieved through the state. So we only think of art as being separate from things like religion and ceremony, but also of things like aristocratic magnificence and things like that. We only think of it as separate from that because of what the state did in nationalising it and making it available for free to everybody who wanted to come in. So we owe the state the concept of art. And then we get this situation where public art and art funded by the state seems to be somehow marginal to art. The real business of art, you talk to anyone in New York, it's only art if it's in a commercial gallery. It only really counts. That's where the thing really happens. And the idea of publicly funded art or art for the public seems to be somehow cheating in some way. Now, interestingly, I've not been able to trace it any further back than this, but as far as I can find out, the concept of public art originates in America in 1910. And so the time that the phrase is first used, public art as a single thing, emerges when various American cities start to compete with one another for their kind of civic responsibility, and then get all of the local wealthy people to put money in a pot to commission art for their city to make their city seem more civilized and not just businesslike. So public art doesn't actually start from the state, it starts from the wealthy trying to rebrand their cities in a very early version of rebranding. So oddly, what's happened is that the concept of art that they were trying to emulate, which is the one based on the French Revolution and the state, ends up becoming kind of privatized in this concept of public art. So you've got a very strange combination of things. And then this thing that starts out as a kind of entrepreneurial activity is then taken up by the state in various other countries. So then public art ends up being a state-funded thing and a state-organised thing and a state-monitored thing. So that's the sort of historical ground on which these problems are based, I think.
Oh, no.
Is pleonasm, basically.
Is what?
Pleonasm is tautology, in a way. So because art per se is public art, because as such it was...
Yeah, that's a very good point. So the first thing being that art originates in its 18th century sense, in its modern sense, as being public and not as private. And because what they've done is they've taken private collections and made them public. So all art, by definition, in that sense, is public. And then public art originates as being private.
I just wanted to sort of narrate this through the history of the community arts movement. For example, in the UK, as a very specific, grounded kind of example of that process of sort of something that started as extra state, as outside of the state, and sort of moved into a state framework. And those who narrated that passage, of course, talk about this very process of it becoming defined and defined again after that, and the importance and sort of failure of that movement to actually engage in a theorization of what had happened in order that they were robust in those kinds of negotiations with the state, and that kind of incorporation process. But nonetheless, if you listen to the early tales of when they did have state funding and the kinds of practices that were enabled in that moment, for example, people who had full funding from the state to work in the miners' strike, travel around and place their skills within very specific political struggles, that does not seem like a dystopian meeting of art and the state, actually, to most of us who hear about them. We can't imagine it, and it's a kind of utopian memory on some level, even.
But it also sounds like a proposition.
And has some tendencies of proposition. Of course, the state is different than it was then at this moment, and so that, of course, links the struggle of a publicly funded arts to a struggle for a different state, and that that is a definite kind of link with other movements who are attempting to bring down this particular form of statehood. So anyway, yeah.
So you.
Simon, in his list of things that had come up in the last panels, Simon, when he gave a list as he introduced this panel, he put the law at the top of demand, struggle, mobilization, organization, the address of the people, and so on. And I'm just reiterating something that came up a lot yesterday, but I'm thinking of scholars, legal scholars, who are trying to think something that Urit raised, which law is one before? And I'm thinking of the work of somebody like Drusilla Cornell, for instance, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos has been mentioned already, but the work that, say, Drusilla and Boa are doing in relation to trying to transform a notion of the law and the kind of we that is evoked through the law, through, as has been mentioned yesterday, through indigenous forms, whether it be Pachamama or Ubuntu, and Drusilla's extraordinary work in South Africa on Ubuntu. And I also want to just think of that tradition that around Antigone, that includes Judith Butler, Butler Khan, and many others, and Zizek and so on, who's thinking the whole question of what law was Antigone submitting herself to when she takes on the law of the state or the city with Creon. So there's you're bringing to mind a different kind of ethic in front of a different kind of law. And I'm thinking of, this was something that we brought up yesterday in relation to Derrida, that the law as a body of institutions in a way, difference really kind of deconstructs that. Everything that Derrida brought about through deconstruction is a kind of unraveling of the stability of the law. And I'm thinking, just to sway ironic, and this was inherent in your talk, Janna, with her work on the ethics of existence, bringing in the micropolitical as a way of, through affect and the drive, as a way of unworking this notion of the law. So I suppose this question is not only addressed to the people on the stage, but also to Irit, because Irit ended her talk yesterday by saying that it really is a question of what law are you before. I think that's what you said. And that's what I'm trying to take up here, that there's been a lot of work that tries to rethink the law as then other than just the law linked with the state.
Well, I think we need to add to that, of course, that the law of the state can also be suspended by the state. So the idea of the state of exception, obviously, which is used, of course, all the time. Right. So even if we identify the law that you stand behind as active at a moment when you don't want it, so this is again this outside interpellation, I think, that is so important, and I think was important yesterday in the discussion of identity, that it's not just something you choose, it's something that chooses you at certain moments. Even there, you cannot identify that law anymore. So therefore your resistance strategies will have to, change as well, because the law, or let's say the lawmakers, the people in power, have also read Derrida. Right? So they have caught up with this. But I don't know if anybody, maybe you wanted to comment on it. Sure.
Just to add to that, of course, Derrida's essay about the force of law shares in common with Agamben this idea that the law is there not to prevent violence, but to sort of enact it. And that's, I think, what Nina was saying earlier very powerfully. But there is another way of thinking about the law, and I was trying to allude to that really in the discussion about rules and regulations, because there are sort of unspoken laws as well, which we voluntarily submit to. And it's interesting that the reason that Rogue Game interested me is precisely because of the way that it doesn't remove the rule. It doesn't deny that the rule is there. It simply converts the rule by slowly eroding it through a kind of spontaneous interaction. So I guess that was my contribution. If anybody else, Dave, go on. I can see your.
There's a question over there.
Law is fiction.
Yeah, law is absolutely fiction. Yes.
The discussion went in slightly different direction, but I just wanted to say that despite the obviousness of what you said about what is perceived as art and what is perceived as public art, there is a different notion of public art. I mean, I live in a constant state of kind of inner protest. I mean, it's just going down now, but I'm not from here. And all my life was practicing public art, mainly in, post-communist countries or in Turkey, where things were possible and where the notion of public art, whether funded by the state or by private individuals, kind of constituted its own laws, which were enabling people to participate or not participate, but just, with the notion of introducing the unfamiliar was triggering a real political action. And I just, I live in a conviction that this is part of my citizenship or our citizenship. This is part of, public arts, part of political action, automatically in a way. So here, when art is, as you said, defined entirely by its inherent market value, it's just so really awfully depressing that there's no way to transgress it and what's public becomes rather a subject of economical deliberation, whether it's worth selling or not, or if you really transgress the boundaries of what's possible, what's not, is simply not installed. I don't know. It's not even a question, but it's a kind of frustration. And I think we should learn from other regions of this world, how to actually redefine the notion of public art, which really has the power of kind of redefine our notion of reality, our notion what's political. I believe it can do it.
I think, I really totally take your point there that art has its own laws, as it were, and that we operate, and the art world operates in accordance with very particular unspoken laws. And the question, the sort of deeper question that you're asking, I think, is that of what counts as art. But what I get asked a lot in working in a politics department is what counts as politics. And that is an equally problematic question. I have the good fortune to belong to an organisation called Artraker, which works with artists in areas of conflict across the world. It has a prize every year, which is a kind of anti-art world prize in a way. One of the really striking things about it is that it produces examples of art which would never count as art in the kind of gallery world context that you're referring to, or in the public art context that you're referring to. And I think this is very interesting because it is a question about who is speaking, where we are speaking from. So, for example, a particular in a recent exhibition, the Artraker exhibition, which was won by a Burmese artist who would not be counted as an artist in the context that we're talking of now. I was standing in the gallery, and a curator whose name shall be unmentioned came in and for a second wondered, said to her friend, "What is this?" It didn't look like art. It was, what she was looking at basically was a picture of a peacock that had been made out of biscuit wrappers, bits of old detritus, looked like maybe pop art of the sort of what we would think of as pop art of the fluxus, maybe, art of the 60s or 70s. It didn't really count in her view as art. And I find this a lot when working with people across the world. And for me, it's much more interesting to think in terms of creativity and potentiality in politicality. So what is the potential of this work? And if it doesn't count as art, why not? And if it doesn't count as politics, why not? Anyone want to join in? Dave?
I'll say something. I suppose the thing that worries me about the concept of public art is the generality of the concept of public in it. So, the thing that I said maybe rather too quickly in my presentation was that I'm interested in art's relation to publics rather than art's relationship to the people. And publics is a different way of thinking about this relationship than the public. And the idea of working for the public is very is just as soul destroying, I think, as you were talking about your frustration. And when I work as an artist and pretty much are considered to be working in the public in some way or another. And I've never called myself a public artist, and the work that I make I don't call public art. It's just art. The reason is I just cannot go along with, first of all, the distinction between art on the one hand and public art on the other. I just think that establishes a relationship of major and minor, where public art is at the rough end of the stick. So in a sense, you have to kind of reclaim the whole of art from within public art by not calling it public art anymore. But also that when you do public art, or you're commissioned by an agency or a gallery or a museum that is interested in you because they think you do public art, and then they talk to you about your concept to the public, and then all of a sudden they're pulling their hair out because they're like, well, you know, we thought you meant many more people than that, you know. I was like, no, we just want to deal with these people right here. And that can be very frustrating for them and for us because they want us to deal with the general public, the public in general. And we're saying, we don't know these people, we can't work with them. You know, we need to organise a kind of a real relationship with real people that we can get together somewhere, you know. You can't put the public in a location, it's really difficult. So you have to work with publics instead, and you establish relationships through actual processes where you can have a dialogical relationship with actual people, with actual voices. So the idea of public art then feels like it's forcing us to address this kind of abstract blob that is great for politicians and is great for people who do opinion formation, you know, and administrators and all of those kinds of people. So we as the art group that I'm involved in tries to avoid using the term public art for that reason.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I just had to get back to what you were saying about creative industries and about avant-garde and about kind of a dislocated, like, art market being something different to the art, or that they're separate kind of discussions. Because I don't believe that. And there was also this narrative and Rushkoff, and I was thinking about behavioral economics, and that economics is a different way of thinking. But behavioral economics is something that's really coming up, and using these aesthetics to have an affect on a public. So if you go back in history, for instance, artists were used by government, by companies, corporates, to influence their consumerism, to influence their ideas, to make them become more individualized. And I just think, I just wanted to kind of throw that in, because I feel a little bit frustrated when this is all happening and there's a lot more focus in, like, okay, the creative industry is going to answer to that, and then art is becoming more and more focused on what it can do as an asset, right? I just felt not really happy with what was said, so I was hoping maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. And on again, what is more like, again, coming back to value. What is value, right?
But it just sounded like you just contradicted yourself, because you were saying that economists understand value that's not economic value, blah 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 blah. And what we're dealing with at the moment is this really difficult situation of art being judged in terms of a cultural industry, which then has these kind of payoffs, economic payoffs. So it's judged in terms of economics, even when we appear to be talking about value. But even when you're talking about behavioural economics, you're talking about, if we can establish certain values around these products, then they will sell more. So again, there's this kind of actual objective payoff that's got nothing to do really with the actual debates that are taking place about value.
But I'm trying to actually get away from the notion of selling more as in a commodity. Like it's also like just kind of getting into a conversation, right, about ideas and about moving on and about proposition. And I think people
to create markets.
Because that's how people understand a lot. And I think this is what I was saying.
Well, we could understand other things as well.
Yes, true.
Okay. I think there was one here, and then there's one there, and then I think you can say, and then we'll close. So 2 more questions, but you want to answer this? Yeah.
I'll just have a go a little bit at that, but I think the idea that everything is kind of part of the creative industries is, in the case of the UK, not entirely true. There is a distinction that's been made between sort of culture as it is produced in cultural sector organizations and the creative industries. It's not that one is not capitalist and the other is. They're both capitalist and they're both market oriented, but they articulate themselves in different ways. For example, the creative industries is applied to any kind of use of creativity in any kind of industry, which is how the governments come up with crazy figures like £1 billion per year contribution to the economy, so that we can say if someone's learned to make a creative latte at Starbucks, they've engaged in the creative industry. So they are slightly different because they're operating under different kinds of regimes of governance, which isn't to say they're not equally market oriented, because the cultural institutions are adhering to the art market and all kinds of things like that. But then I think the other thing that you're talking about is, and maybe relates to the last comment, is the kind of question, that this kind of Vernow's formulation of publicness without a public sphere, which is the kind of political-like behavior that one engages in the market, which is a kind of publicness, as though one is engaged in political efforts, but within the context of a highly marketized environment. And I mean, he's critical of that, and I think one should be, though it's often very difficult to say when you are operating in this publicness with the public sphere when in its absence. So then what is produced to actually validate those forms of publicness from another perspective, and a perspective that is critical and against a particular market framework. So I think just sets out a different set of differentiations, which isn't about creative sector or cultural sector. It's about something else. It's about the political legitimacy, I suppose, of a certain kind of publicness.
Well, maybe I'm a little bit confused, and sometimes it's also for me difficult in this frozen situation to follow English, this language. So, but in when we're speaking about the law, and when we I still, of course, we can speak about the institutions which implement the law, which organize the structure, how the law is incorporated in us and surrounds us. But then what is in this discussion a little bit for me unsharp, or maybe I misunderstood it, is the fact that we're speaking about different layers of laws. So at one example, when you start about the riots and the situation in a riot and the subject which is operating in it, it's operating on two levels. It's operating as this individuum acting there, and at the end the law identified it also as this individuum, but it's also identified in a collective space, which is it's identified through a law about a spatial structure. Then the spatial structure is also again very, very complex organized, because there's something which you call the law and the order of this public sphere. But you also, in the meantime, what is transformed by the neoliberal capitalistic system is that space and spatial practices are not longer identified by what we call the public law. It's identified by questions of the private law. Then we losing the frontiers in which you identify the individuum which is operating in this space, and what it could be done in the space and what not by this individuum. So this notion of law, it became incredible complex in the meantime. And when we're going from this perspective and looking and speaking about us, the we in regard and in relationship to state, then we even experience the same transformation of what we could call a state and the limits of the state and how a state could operate as a state nowadays. Because the state as a structure is at least falling apart when we're speaking about structures of laws. We can, you're shaking the head, but this is one of the inner conflicts which we are facing there. So maybe I'm really confused, but I'm thinking when we're speaking about this kind of structures and then how to organize, at one example, resistance, how we organize community projects, when we start to create positivistic knowledge, which could be easily abused. So this is one of the questions for me along public art, very much. Public art as a structure of giving visibility is every time with one step on the side of producing a positivistic knowledge which could empower structures of control. So this is only as a comment.
I'll give a positivistic answer because I don't actually totally agree with your analysis. I think we identified that there are complex layers of law and there are rules of behavior, rules of conduct, which is not the same as laws. So, but I think that if you look in terms of the law of the state, I think you're right in the fact that your rights have been eroded. But law enforcement has not been eroded, and I'll give that as a positive answer, that everything in the state formations of the United States and the West, the former West, is being defunded except security, police, and military. And that has actually increased after the end of the Cold War. So there the state is very much still the state and very clear about its law enforcement.
For what function is operating in this area? What are the aims which are identified for this police and military operations?
The aims? Control.
Well, like it's like who gets to define violence for one thing, who gets to define theft. I mean, this is about property and this is about force. And these things are not, look, just because you have like private security forces, right, it doesn't mean they're not backed up by the state. I mean, this idea that we live in this, some post-state world is just bullshit. We are literally surrounded and constructed by the state's definition of what violence is and what theft is. People don't go to prison for ripping everyone off, which is what the ruling class does. They go to prison for stealing a bottle of water in the riots. It couldn't be any clearer. It's not complicated, is it?
Maybe we should allow for the last. I think we're running very late. So,
just quite a simple question, actually. In terms of the art, politics, culture, should we be removing distinctions and kind of breaking that down, or working towards further defining it?
That's not a simple question.
no.
It's a short question.
Well, I think they constitute each other anyway. I think they are already interlinked. That would be my answer, but you probably have another one.
Sometimes we should, and sometimes we shouldn't. It's a classic academic answer, that is.
Okay, I think with that we break for lunch. Okay? We'll be back at 2:15.